So today we're going to talk about a topic that has been argued into the ground. That is going to be, where should you mount your radiator? And I'm not talking about the typical argument of which way should your hoses go. I won't say which way should your hose go, but that's an entirely different video. But we're talking about whether or not your rad should go on the top of the PC or the front of the PC. And there's two schools of thought. So why don't you do me a favor? Pause the video now, go ahead and trash talk, then watch, and then trash talk again.
Hey, Day. Day. Day.
What?
We got work to do.
Yeah, I'm playing World of Warships. Yeah. World of Warships is the free-to-play naval strategy game where you command the most iconic and famous warships from World War I and World War II, recreated with stunning detail and accuracy. Build your fleet while participating in various game types while upgrading your ship's arsenal along the way. New players who sign up using my link below will receive an exclusive starter pack to get you up and running quickly by receiving 7 days premium time, 1 million credits, 300 doubloons, and the Tier 5 premium ship, the Exeter. So what are you guys waiting for? Start sinking ships with World of Warships by heading to the description below and getting your freebies. So it's probably not gonna be a very long video here, but let's talk about some of the methodology that we used. But before we do that, head over to Discord. If you guys wanna really yell at me and you want me to see it, and you want a good chance of me actually seeing it, head over to discord.gg/jays2cents and go in there into the video feedback page or channel, and then just go ahead and yell at a cloud there. I'll probably actually see it. But anyway, moving on, let's go ahead and just talk about some of the methodology here. So this is an AMD 7950X. It's a 16 core, 32 thread, dual CCD CPU. And they have a thermal limit of 95C. And they're designed to push themselves as close to 95C as they can get. So I figured it was a pretty good CPU for this. Also too, it's just a nice break from all the Intel monotony for a multitude of reasons. But yeah, so we tested a 1 hour run. So these are 1 hour runs with my Arctic 360 Freezer 3 AIO, not the 420, so I wanted to do kind of a more realistic, like a lot of people go with 360s these days because CPUs are so demanding with temperatures and power limits and stuff available to them. So we put the 360 on the top as an exhaust and on the front as an intake, and then ran OCCT AVX2 instruction set on extreme profile with all cores loaded with no variable. So it's just hammer away at it for an hour. We did a 1 hour test on this. I wanted to make sure a couple of things. One, full heat soak of every component inside the system so that we can see what the before and after is going to be. Now, the other thing we did too is fans were locked. What I mean by that is the fans for the AIO were at 100%, the fans for the chassis, which are 140s, one in the rear, and then 3 either on the front as intake or on the top as exhaust, depending on how we switched the rad. The 140s were either exhaust or intake, and those were set to 65% fan speed. And the reason why I did that is these Antec fans inside the Flux Pro are actually very loud and very, very strong. So I put it at 65% because that's where it noise normalized closer to about 40 decibels, which is where a lot of people like to kind of normalize noise. Also too, this is a climate controlled room. So 73 degrees Fahrenheit is where the thermostat was set, and it clicked over 74, like right at the end of the second test. But anyway, that's a 0.6C delta between runs if you're curious. Now, if we had like a 5C run differential or like a 9C run differential between like starting the test one and then it's like 80 degrees Fahrenheit in the second test, clearly that is a very flawed result and we would have to do a delta offset. So in this, I just wanted you to know that there is a 0.6C delta difference between both of these runs in terms of the ambient temperature. Last but not least, these two fans on the bottom right here were turned off. They were not on because this would have been pulling in fresh air from the bottom, which would have negated the whole test of saying if your only intakes are coming through the radiator, which is dumping heat into the chassis, how's that going to affect performance and cooling of your other components? Having those fans on would have absolutely flawed that test. So they were not on at all. I want to point that out. They are completely unplugged right now from the hub that they are pre-installed on. With that said, let's go ahead and get right into the results here. So the blue line is the top rad test. So the top rad meaning fans are on the bottom of the radiator pushing out. That's also one difference I want to point out. On the front, to be able to make it fit, the fans are mounted on the inside of the radiator, making them a pull configuration. So there is a pull config versus a push config. And there's some debate there, and that's probably gonna be the next video I make regarding radiators, is how much of a difference is there between pull and push. I'll go ahead and spoil that for you now. I've done this test multiple times throughout the years. It's about a 1 to 1.5C difference depending on how easily the fans can access the air. What I mean by that is your case airflow is going to have much more of an important impact on whether or not a push config on top can move the air versus a pull config on the front, because it has a lot of resistance that it has to either push through or pull through, which is the radiator fins and a grill in this instance, or on the top it has to push out through a vent or through ventilation and mesh. It's very, very, very negligible. But I wanted to point it out because someone's gonna say, but this is the pull and that's the push and that's the difference. Moving on, the light blue line is the top radiator configuration. So the time duration of this chart is 1 hour. And you can see that we capped out at about 83 C. I know it's kind of hard to see on the line, but I can tell you right now, the hottest temperature that was actually recorded was like 82.8 C. But as soon as we move the radiator to the front, as you would expect, there is a little bit of a drop. The reason for that is it is getting supplied nice, fresh air from the front. Now, the only thing that this would really mean is that either the volume of air inside the chassis is a little bit restrictive, that's slowing down the airflow coming through, because there's nothing else generating heat inside here. The GPU is sitting there idle, doing nothing with the fans not turning. We'll talk about the GPU in a second. It just means that it's getting a nice fresh airflow right here. This volume of air in front of the case is way bigger than the volume of air inside the chassis. And yes, obviously we had the side panel on, I want to point that out. But there is only a 2.2 C difference between the hottest of the front rad versus the hottest of the top rad. And that's accounting for the 0.6 C difference in the room when the temperature went up slightly. So as you can see, it is a very, very close test. Now, a result nonetheless. Radiator on the front meant cooler CPUs. Now the argument isn't whether or not it's better for your CPU. The argument is whether or not it's better or worse to put it in the front for the other components sitting inside your chassis. So we're talking about especially passive cooled components like RAM, PCH coolers, VRM coolers. In this instance, we're using the GPU as a thermometer to see what happened with the air temperature inside the case and to see how the temperature was affected there. So this RTX 4080 Super was sitting here with the fans at 0 RPM, doing nothing but being a passive thermometer for us to see what happened to the air temperature inside the case. So anyway, when we take a look at GPU, we're looking at the hotspot temperature as well as the main GPU temperature that is displayed. And those are typically about a 10 C delta between the two. And it shows throughout this chart that that's exactly what happens. Now, what I think is interesting here is if you look at the start of the test, the hotspot was just under 40 C and the main temperature was at 30 C. When I say main temp, I just mean the main temperature die that reads the temperature on the GPU. It actually came down a little bit as the test went on. Now, that's interesting because the radiator fans were at 100% and the chassis fans were at 65% locked, no ramping. So one could argue like, well, the fans ramped up, which meant more airflow, which meant it cooled down your GPU that's just sitting there passively by the air being exchanged inside the case. I have no idea why it actually started to drop a little bit. Like I said, these bottom fans were not on. They did not turn on, they're unplugged entirely. So that had no effect on the test whatsoever. But it should be no surprise when we switch the radiator to the front and we run the same test for 1 hour, you see a steady rise in temperature on the GPU. That rise was actually about 4.5 C. So what we could also argue is that the internal temperature of the case actually rose 4.5 C. That's another test I feel like I should do someday where temperatures that are ambient affect the components themselves in a 1-to-1 ratio. If the temperature in the room goes up 5 C, the temperatures inside go up 5 C, and the components go up 5 C. I'm sure someone out there that understands fluid dynamics could probably explain the reason why that is in a more mathematician way that I won't understand. But all I know is that's the way it works, okay? So obviously the warm air, the fresh air is coming through the radiator. The CPU is putting about 180 watts, which is the max wattage draw of the 7950X, into this radiator, which is heat exchanging, which means the cold air is coming through the rad. Heat wants to move to cold. That is the way that I know temperature moves. Heat moves to cold, not the other way around. In fact, cold is relative. There's no such thing as cold. All temperatures are measured in heat. Even things that are frozen are heat. So it wants to move from hotter temperature to lesser hotter temperature. That is the way that the motion of heat is. As the air is moving through, it gets exchanged, which means the heat is removed from the heat exchanger into the atmosphere. Well, when you have a front-mounted rad pulling air in, the atmosphere is now in there. So now it's the exhaust fan's job to get that air out as fast as possible. Now, if the fan's on top are pulling in more air than the fans in the front can feed, or the rear fan is removing air as a collective, I guarantee this was a negative pressure situation, so the temperature could have been worse, believe it or not. However, they were going to be pulling in air from any vents that were available, but we still saw a 4.5 C climb for the GPU temperatures. So what does that mean? Well, as you can see, yes, the front radiator mount does affect the temperatures. However, what I've seen argued religiously on the internet is that by putting a radiator in the front of your PC will cause such a heat soak in your system that you'll cause throttling for your other components. Now that 4C rise does mean our max temperature for our GPU, if we had static fans and they weren't able to adjust to the temperature curve, would also rise 4C. But guess what? Most people don't have their fans set to static. Most people have their fans set to a curve. So as the temp goes up, the fans would go up, which means if I had a temperature curve set up, more than likely, we would have seen the temperatures stay probably fairly average, about the same. So if I had the radiator mounted to the front and the top fan set at 65%, and I wanted to negate the extra temperature that's making its way into the chassis because of the hot radiator, I could have probably moved them to about 75% under load and negated that by bringing in more fresh air through the other vents that are in the case. Ideally, I would want to have the front fans moving in as much air as possible and then just balance it through the other fans. But the problem is these fans were already running at 100%, so that was kind of like the worst possible scenario here, which was about 4.5 C for the GPU. Now, none of this situation right here would have led to any sort of throttling. The CPU, it's funny that the CPU saw just over a 2C delta between front and top, but the GPU saw a 4.5 degree difference between those two configurations. So that means obviously more heat was efficiently making its way into the radiator, but the radiator was obviously causing a hotter environment overall inside the chassis. I think this just goes to show that you don't have to fret so much about whether or not your radiator's in the front or your radiator's in the top. And if you're wondering why I even made this video, like I said, over the last few weeks, I have joined many PC enthusiast groups, just lurking, not talking really so much, not making my presence known, and seeing what people are saying. And people are saying some dumbass stuff. That's all I'm gonna say right now. And so this is one of those videos I wanted to make to just show, like, anytime someone shows their post and the rad's on the front, it's the same thing. You're heating up all your stuff and causing a thermal throttling. And it's like, so this is my response.